Be so good they can't ignore you. Beyond passion. Before continuing, I should emphasize an obvious point. For some people, following their passion works. The Road Trip Nation archives, for example, include an interview with Rolling Stone film critic Peter Travers, who claims that even as a child, he used to bring notebooks into movie theaters to record his thoughts. The power of passion is even more common when you look to the careers of gifted individuals, such as professional athletes. You'll be hard-pressed, for example, to find a professional baseball player who doesn't claim that he has been passionate about the sport as far back as he can remember. Some people I've talked to about my ideas have used examples of this type to dismiss my conclusions about passion. Here's a case where someone successfully followed their passion, they say. Therefore, follow your passion must be good advice. This is faulty logic. Observing a few instances of a strategy working does not make it universally effective. It is necessary instead to study a large number of examples and ask what worked in the vast majority of the cases. And when you study a large group of people who are passionate about what they do, as I did in researching this book, you'll find that most, not all, will tell a story more complex than simply identifying a pre-existing passion and then pursuing it. Examples such as Peter Travers and professional athletes, therefore, are exceptions. If anything, their rareness underscores my claim that for most people, follow your passion is bad advice. This conclusion inspires an important follow-up question. Without the passion hypothesis to guide us, what should we do instead? This is the question I take up in the 3 rules that follow. These rules chronicle my quest to figure out how people really end up loving what they do. They represent a shift away from the tone of lawyerly argument used here and into something more personal, evidence of my attempts to capture the complexity and ambiguity of my encounters with the reality of workplace happiness. With the thorny underbrush of the passion hypothesis cleared, we can only now bring light to a more realistic strain of career advice that has so long been strangled in the shadows. This is a process that begins in the next rule with my arrival at an unlikely source of insight, a group of bluegrass musicians practicing their craft in the suburbs of Boston. Rule number 2. Be so good they can't ignore you. Or the importance of skill. Chapter 4, The Clarity of the Craftsman, in which I introduce 2 different approaches to thinking about work. The craftsman mindset, a focus on what value you're producing in your job, and the passion mindset, a focus on what value your job offers you. Most people adopt the passion mindset, but in this chapter I argue that the craftsman mindset is the foundation for creating work you love. Upstairs at the Bluegrass Frat House. When I first rounded the corner onto Mapleton Street, the house, a careworn Victorian, blended in with its tidy suburban neighbors. It was only as I got closer that I noticed the eccentricities. The paint was peeling. There was a pair of leather recliners outside on the porch. Empty Bud Light bottles littered the ground. Jordan Tice, a professional guitar player of the new acoustic style, stood by the front door smoking a cigarette. He waved me over. As I followed him inside, I noticed that a small foyer set off the entry had been converted into a bedroom. "The banjo player who sleeps there has a PhD from MIT, Jordan said. "You'd like him." Jordan is one of the many musicians who come and go from the rental, squeezing themselves into any space that meets the technical definition of habitable. "Welcome to the Bluegrass Frat House," he said by way of explanation as we headed up to the 2nd floor where he lives. Jordan's room is monastic. Smaller than any dorm room I had at college, it's just big enough for a twin bed and a simple pressboard desk. A Fender tube amp sits in one corner and a rolling luggage bag in the other. Most of his guitars, I assume, are kept downstairs in the common practice space, as I only saw one in the room, a beat-up Martin. We had to borrow a chair from another room so that we could both sit. Jordan is 24. In the world of traditional work, this is young. But when you consider that he signed his first record deal while still in high school, it's clear that in the world of acoustic music, Jordan's no rookie. He's also painfully modest. One review of his third album, Long Story, began, "Music has always had its share of prodigies, from Mozart up to the current day." This is exactly the type of praise that Jordan would hate for me to write about. When I asked him why Gary Ferguson, a well-known bluegrass artist, chose Jordan at the age of 16 to tour with him, he could only stammer before lapsing into silence. "It's a big deal," I pushed. "He chose you to be his guitar player. He had his choice of lots of guitar players, and he chose a 16-year-old. "I don't derive any arrogance from that specific thing," he finally answered. Here's what does excite Jordan: his music. When I asked him, "What are you working on today?" his eyes lit up as he grabbed an open composition book from his desk. On it were 5 lines of music, lightly penciled in, mainly dense runs of quarter notes spanning up and down the octave, punctuated with the occasional handwritten explanation. "I'm kind of working on a new tune," he explained. "It's going to be really fast." Jordan picked up his Martin to play me the new song. It had the driving beat of bluegrass, but the melody, which was inspired by a Debussy composition, happily disregards the genre. When Jordan played, he stared just beyond the fretboard and breathed in sharp, sporadic gasps. At one point he missed a note, which upset him. He backed up and started again, insisting on playing until he finished the full phrase without mistake. I told him I was impressed by the speed of the licks. "No, this is slow," he replied. He then showed me the pace he's working toward. It's at least twice as fast. "I can't quite make the lead trail yet," he apologized after it slipped away from him. "I guess I could do it, but I can't get the notes to pop out yet like I wanted." He showed me how the successive notes in the lead tend to span many strings, complicating fast picking. It's really wide. At my request, Jordan laid out his practice regimen for this song. He starts by playing slow enough that he can get the effects he desires. He wants the keynotes of the melody to ring while he fills the space in between with runs up and down the fretboard. Then he adds speed, just enough that he can't quite make things work. He repeats this again and again. "It's a physical and mental exercise," he explained. "You're trying to keep track of different melodies and things. In a piano, everything is laid out clearly in front of you, 10 fingers never getting in the way of one another. On the guitar, you have to budget your fingers." He called his work on this song his technical focus of the moment. In a typical day, if he's not preparing for a show, he'll practice with this same intensity, always playing just a little faster than he's comfortable, for 2 or 3 hours straight. I asked him how long it will take to finally master the new skill. "Probably like a month," he guessed. Then he played through the lick one more time. The craftsman mindset. Let me be clear about something. I really don't care if Jordan Tice loves what he does. I also don't care why he decided to become a musician or whether he sees guitar playing as his passion. Musicians' career paths are idiosyncratic, often relying on unusual circumstances and lucky breaks early in life. The fact that Jordan's parents are both bluegrass musicians, for example, obviously played a big role in his early dedication to guitar. Because of this, I've never found the origin stories of performers' careers to be all that relevant to the rest of us. Here's what does interest me about Jordan: how he approaches his work on a daily basis. Lurking here, I discovered, is an insight of great value to my quest for work I love. The path that led me to Jordan and the insight he represents began with a 2007 episode of The Charlie Rose Show. Rose was interviewing the actor and comedian Steve Martin about his memoir, Born Standing Up. They talked about the realities of Martin's rise. "I read autobiographies in general, Martin said, "and I often get frustrated and say, 'You left out that one part here. How did you get that audition for that one thing where suddenly you're working at the Copa? How did that happen?'" Martin wrote his book to answer the how question, at least with respect to his own success in stand-up. It was in this explanation of how that Martin introduced a simple idea that floored me when I first heard it. The quote comes in the last 5 minutes of the interview, when Rose asks Martin his advice for aspiring performers. "Nobody ever takes note of my advice because it's not the answer they wanted to hear," Martin said. "What they want to hear is, here's how you get an agent, here's how you write a script. But I always say, be so good they can't ignore you." In response to Rose's trademark ambiguous grunt, Martin defended his advice. If somebody's thinking, "How can I be really good?" people are going to come to you. This is exactly the philosophy that catapulted Martin into stardom. He was only 20 years old when he decided to innovate his act into something too good to be ignored. Comedy at the time was all setup and punchline, the cliched nightclub comedian rat-a-tat-tat, Martin explained to Rose. He thought it could be something more sophisticated. Here's how Martin explained his evolution in an article he published around the time of his Charlie Rose interview. What if there were no punchlines? What if there were no indicators? What if I created tension and never released it? What if I headed for a climax, but all I delivered was an anticlimax? In one famous bit, Martin tells the audience that it's time for his famous nose on the microphone routine. He then leans in and puts his nose on the microphone for several seconds, steps back, takes a long bow, and with gravitas, thanks the crowd. The laugh came not then, he explains, but only after they realized I had already moved on to the next bit. It took Martin, by his own estimation, 10 years for his new act to cohere, but when it did, he became a monster success. It's clear in his telling that there was no real shortcut to his eventual fame. Eventually, you are so experienced that there's a confidence that comes out, Martin explained. I think it's something the audience smells. Be so good they can't ignore you. When I first heard this advice, I was watching the Martin interview online. It was the winter of 2008, and I was approaching my final year as a graduate student. At the time, I had recently started a blog called Study Hacks, which was inspired by the pair of student advice guides I had published and focused mainly on tips for undergraduates. Soon after hearing Martin's axiom, however, I dashed off a blog post that introduced his idea to my readers. Sure, it's scary, I concluded, but even more, I find it liberating. As my graduate student career had been winding down, I had become obsessed with my research strategy, an obsession that was manifested in the chronic working and reworking of the description of my work on my website. This was a frustrating process. I felt like I was stretching to convince the world that my work was interesting, yet no one cared. Martin's axiom gave me a reprieve from this self-promotion. Stop focusing on these little details, it told me. Focus instead on becoming better. Inspired, I turned my attention from my website to a habit that continues to this day. I track the hours spent each month dedicated to thinking hard about research problems. In the month in which I first wrote this chapter, for example, I dedicated 42 hours to these core tasks. This hour-tracking strategy helped turn my attention back, above all else, to the quality of what I produce. At the same time, however, it also felt incremental, as if I hadn't yet grasped the full implications of Martin's radical idea. When I later launched my quest to uncover how people end up loving their work, it didn't take long for me to return to Martin's advice. Intuitively, I grasped that it played an important role in constructing a remarkable career. This is what led me to Jordan Tice. If I really wanted to understand this axiom, I figured, I needed to understand the people who live their lives by it. Listening to Tice talk about his routine, I was struck by his Martin-esque focus on what he produces. As you'll recall, he's happy to spend hours every day, week after week, in a barely furnished monastic room, exhausting himself in pursuit of a new flat-picking technique, all because he thinks it will add something important to the tune he's writing. This dedication to output, I realized, also explains his painful modesty. To Jordan, arrogance doesn't make sense. Here's what I respect: creating something meaningful and then presenting it to the world, he explained. Inspired by meeting Jordan, I got in touch with Mark Castevens to gain a cynical veteran's perspective on the performer's mindset. Mark is a studio musician from Nashville who has certainly earned his stripes. He's played on 99 #1 hit singles on the Billboard charts. When I told Mark about Jordan, he agreed that an obsessive focus on the quality of what you produce is the rule in professional music. It trumps your appearance, your equipment, your personality, and your connections, he explained. Studio musicians have this adage: the tape doesn't lie. Immediately after the recording comes the playback. Your ability has no hiding place. I like that phrase, the tape doesn't lie, as it sums up nicely what motivates performers such as Jordan, Mark, and Steve Martin. If you're not focusing on becoming so good they can't ignore you, you're going to be left behind. This clarity was refreshing. To simplify things going forward, I'll call this output-centric approach to work the craftsman mindset. My goal in rule number 2 is to convince you of an idea that became clearer to me the more time I spent studying performers such as Tice. Irrespective of what type of work you do, the craftsman mindset is crucial for building a career you love. Before we get ahead of ourselves, however, I want to take a moment to contrast this mindset with the way most of us are used to thinking about our livelihood. The passion mindset. People thrive by focusing on the question of who they really are and connecting that to work they truly love. Poe Bronson wrote this in a 2002 manifesto published in Fast Company. This should sound familiar, as it's exactly the type of advice you would give if you subscribed to the passion hypothesis, which I debunked in rule number 1. With this in mind, let's call the approach to work endorsed by Bronson the passion mindset. Whereas the craftsman mindset focuses on what you can offer the world, the passion mindset focuses instead on what the world can offer you. This mindset is how most people approach their working lives. There are 2 reasons why I dislike the passion mindset. That is, 2 reasons beyond the fact that, as I argued in rule number 1, it's based on a false premise. First, when you focus only on what your work offers you, it makes you hyper-aware of what you don't like about it, leading to chronic unhappiness. This is especially true for entry-level positions, which, by definition, are not going to be filled with challenging projects and autonomy. These come later. When you enter the working world with the passion mindset, the annoying tasks you're assigned, or the frustrations of corporate bureaucracy, can become too much to handle. Second, and more serious, the deep questions driving the passion mindset, who am I and what do I truly love, are essentially impossible to confirm. Is this who I really am? And do I love this? Rarely reduced to clear yes or no responses. In other words, the passion mindset is almost guaranteed to keep you perpetually unhappy and confused, which probably explains why Bronson admits, not long into his career seeker epic, What Should I Do with My Life?, that the one feeling everyone in this book has experienced is of missing out on life. Adopting the craftsman mindset. To summarize, I presented 2 different ways people think about their working life. The first is the craftsman mindset, which focuses on what you can offer the world. The second is the passion mindset, which instead focuses on what the world can offer you. The craftsman mindset offers clarity, while the passion mindset offers a swamp of ambiguous and unanswerable questions. As I concluded after meeting Jordan Tice, there's something liberating about the craftsman mindset. It asks you to leave behind self-centered concerns about whether your job is just right, and instead put your head down and plug away at getting really damn good. No one owes you a great career, it argues. You need to earn it, and the process won't be easy. With this in mind, it's only natural to envy the clarity of performers like Jordan Tice. But here's the core argument of rule number 2. You shouldn't just envy the craftsman mindset, you should emulate it. In other words, I'm suggesting that you put aside the question of whether your job is your true passion and instead turn your focus toward becoming so good they can't ignore you. That is, regardless of what you do for a living, approach your work like a true performer. This shift in mindset proved an exciting development in my own quest. But as I discovered, it comes more easily for some than for others. When I began exploring the craftsman mindset on my blog, some of my readers became uneasy. I noticed them starting to home in on a common counter-argument, which I should address before we continue. Here's how one reader put it. Tice is willing to grind out long hours with little recognition, but that's because it's in service to something he's obviously passionate about and has been for a long time. He's found that one job that's right for him. I've heard this reaction enough times to give it a name, the argument from pre-existing passion. At its core is the idea that the craftsman mindset is only viable for those who already feel passionate about their work, and therefore it cannot be presented as an alternative to the passion mindset. I don't buy it. First, let's dispense with the notion that performers like Jordan Tice or Steve Martin are perfectly secure in their knowledge that they've found their true calling. If you spend any time with professional entertainers, especially those who are just starting out, one of the first things you notice is their insecurity concerning their livelihood. Jordan had a name for the worries about what his friends are doing with their lives, and whether his accomplishments compare favorably. The cloud of external distractions. Fighting this cloud is an ongoing battle. Along these lines, Steve Martin was so unsure during his decade-long dedication to improving his routine that he regularly suffered crippling anxiety attacks. The source of these performers' craftsman mindset is not some unquestionable inner passion, but instead something more pragmatic. It's what works in the entertainment business. As Mark Stevens put it, the tape doesn't lie. If you're a guitar player or a comedian, what you produce is basically all that matters. If you spend too much time focusing on whether or not you found your true calling, the question will be rendered moot when you find yourself out of work. Second, and more fundamental, I don't really care why performers adopt the craftsman mindset. As I mentioned earlier, their world is idiosyncratic, and most of what makes them tick doesn't generalize. The reason I focused on Jordan's story is that I wanted you to see what the craftsman mindset looked like in action. In other words, forget why Jordan adopted this mindset, and notice instead how he deploys it. In the next chapter, I will argue that regardless of how you feel about your job right now, adopting the craftsman mindset will be the foundation on which you'll build a compelling career. This is why I reject the argument from pre-existing passion, because it gets things backward. In reality, as I'll demonstrate, you adopt the craftsman mindset first, and then the passion follows. Chapter 5. The Power of Career Capital, in which I justify the importance of the craftsman mindset by arguing that the traits that make a great job great are rare and valuable, and therefore, if you want a great job, you need to build up rare and valuable skills, which I call career capital, to offer in return. The economics of great jobs. In the last chapter, I offered a bold proposition. If you want to love what you do, abandon the passion mindset. What can the world offer me? And instead, adopt the craftsman mindset. What can I offer the world? My argument for this strategy starts with a simple question. What makes a great job great? In exploring this question, it helps to get specific. In rule number 1, I provided several examples of people who had great jobs and loved what they do, so we can draw from there. Among others, I introduced Apple founder Steve Jobs, radio host Ira Glass, and master surfboard shaper Al Merrick. Using this trio as our running example, I can now ask what it is specifically about these three careers that makes them so compelling. Here are the answers that I came up with. Traits that define great work. Creativity. Ira Glass, for example, is pushing the boundaries of radio and winning armfuls of awards in the process. Impact. From the Apple II to the iPhone, Steve Jobs has changed the way we live our lives in the digital age. Control. No one tells Al Merrick when to wake up or what to wear. He's not expected in an office from 9 to 5. Instead, his Channel Island Surfboards factory is located a block from the Santa Barbara beach, where Merrick still regularly spends time surfing. Jake Burton Carpenter, founder of Burton Snowboards, for example, recalls how negotiations for the merger between the two companies happened while he and Merrick waited for waves in a surf lineup. This list isn't comprehensive, but if you consider your own dream job fantasies, you'll likely notice some combination of these traits. We can now advance to the question that really matters. How do you get these traits in your own working life? One of the first things I noticed when I began to study this question is that these factors are rare. Most jobs don't offer their employees great creativity, impact, or control over what they do and how they do it. If you're a recent college graduate in an entry-level job, for example, you're much more likely to hear, "Go change the water cooler," than you are, "Go change the world." By definition, we also know that these traits are valuable, as they're the key to making a job great. But now we're moving into well-trod territory. Basic economic theory tells us that if you want something that's both rare and valuable, you need something rare and valuable to offer in return. This is Supply and Demand 101. It follows that if you want a great job, you need something of great value to offer in return. If this is true, of course, we should see it in the stories of our trio of examples, and we do. Now that we know what to look for, this transactional interpretation of compelling careers becomes suddenly apparent. Consider Steve Jobs. When Jobs walked into Paul Terrell's bite shop, he was holding something that was literally rare and valuable, the circuit board for the Apple I, one of the more advanced personal computers in the fledgling market at the time. The money from selling 100 units of that original design gave Jobs more control in his career. But in classic economic terms, to get even more valuable traits in his working life, he needed to increase the value of what he had to offer. It's at this point that Jobs' ascent began to accelerate. He takes on $250,000 in funding from Mark Markula and works with Steve Wozniak to produce a new computer design that is unambiguously too good to be ignored. There were other engineers in the Bay Area's homebrew computer club culture who could match Jobs and Wozniak's technical skill, but Jobs had the insight to take on investment and to focus this technical energy toward producing a complete product. The result was the Apple II, a machine that leaped ahead of the competition. It had color graphics. The monitor and keyboard were integrated inside the case. The architecture was open, allowing rapid expansion of memory and peripherals, such as the floppy disk, which the Apple II was the first to introduce into mainstream use. This was the product that put the company on the map and that pushed Jobs from a small-time entrepreneur into the head of a visionary company. He produced something of great value, and in return, his career got an injection of creativity, impact, and control. The radio host Ira Glass was given the opportunity to create his genre-defining radio show, This American Life, only after he had proven himself as one of public radio's best editors and hosts. Glass started as an intern and then moved on to become a tape cutter for All Things Considered. There are many young people who start down the same path as Glass, landing an internship at a local NPR station and then moving up to a low-level production position. But Glass began to break away from the pack when he turned his focus on making his skills more rare and more valuable. The crispness of his segment editing eventually gained him the opportunity to host a few of his own segments on air. And even though Glass has a voice that mocks everything sacred about what a radio personality should sound like, He began to win awards for his segments. It's possible that a latent natural talent for editing may be playing a role here. But recall from rule number 1 that Glass emphasizes the importance of the hard work required to develop skill. All of us who do creative work, you get into this thing and there's like a gap. What you're making isn't so good, okay? It's trying to be good, but it's just not that great, he explained in an interview about his career. The key thing is to force yourself through the work, force the skills to come. That's the hardest phase, he elaborated in his Road Trip Nation session. In other words, this is not the story of a prodigy who walked into a radio station after college and walked out with a show. The more you read about Glass, the more you encounter a young man who was driven to develop his skills until they were too valuable to be ignored. This strategy worked. After the success of his short segments for All Things Considered, Glass was tapped to co-host a string of different local shows produced out of Chicago's WBEZ station, further increasing the value of his skills. In 1995, when the station manager at WBEZ decided to put together a free-form show with an eye toward national syndication, a show called This American Life, Glass was at the top of his list. His career today is rich with creativity, impact, and control, but when you read his story, the economic undertones are unmistakable. Glass exchanged a collection of hard-won, rare, and valuable skills for his fantastic job. With Al Merrick, not surprisingly, we get the same style of story. The rare and valuable skill that launched Merrick's career as a professional surfboard shaper is crystal clear. His boards won competitions. What's important to note is that this was not always the case. Merrick picked up the trade of fiberglass shaping from his years spent as a boat builder, and he knew about surfing from his own on-again, off-again relationship with the sport, but it took an abundance of hard work to get his board crafting skills to the place where they were valuable. Starting out, a lot of time you're afraid that you're going to be a failure, that this guy you're making a board for is a world champion and his boards won't be working right, he recalled in his Road Trip Nation session. It just makes me work harder and try harder to accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish with a surfboard. Having an office a block from the beach with the freedom to take off to surf on a moment's notice sounds great, but it's not the type of job that is just being handed out. To get it, Merrick realized he needed a rare and valuable skill to offer in exchange. Once he had surf pros like Kelly Slater riding his boards and winning, he became free to dictate the terms of his working life. Here, then, are the main strands of my argument. The career capital theory of great work. The traits that define great work are rare and valuable. Supply and demand says that if you want these traits, you need rare and valuable skills to offer in return. Think of these rare and valuable skills you can offer as your career capital. The craftsman mindset, with its relentless focus on becoming so good they can't ignore you, is a strategy well suited for acquiring career capital. This is why it trumps the passion mindset if your goal is to create work you love. Jobs, Glass, and Merrick all adopted the craftsman mindset. Some even use these exact words in describing themselves. "I was a craftsman," said Merrick in an interview on his early days as a board shaper. Career capital theory tells us that this is no coincidence. The traits that define great work require that you have something rare and valuable to offer in return, skills I call career capital. The craftsman mindset, with its relentless focus on what you produce, is exactly the mindset you would adopt if your goal was to acquire as much career capital as possible. Ultimately, this is why I promote the craftsman mindset over the passion mindset. This is not some philosophical debate on the existence of passion or the value of hard work. I'm being intensely pragmatic. You need to get good in order to get good things in your working life, and the craftsman mindset is focused on achieving exactly this goal. But there is, I must admit, a darker corollary to this argument. The passion mindset is not just ineffective for creating work you love. In many cases, it can actively work against this goal, sometimes with devastating consequences. From Courage to Food Stamps. A pair of articles published within 2 days of each other in the New York Times in the summer of 2009 emphasized the contrast between the passion mindset and the craftsman mindset. The first article concerned Lisa Fewer. At the age of 38, Fewer quit her career in advertising and marketing. Chafing under the constraints of corporate life, she started to question whether this was her calling. "I'd watched my husband go into business for himself, and I felt like I could do it too," she said. So she decided to give entrepreneurship a try. As reported by the Times, Fewer enrolled in a 200-hour yoga instruction course, tapping a home equity loan to pay the $4,000 tuition. Certification in hand, she started Karma Kids Yoga, a yoga practice focused on young children and pregnant women. "I love what I do," she told the reporter when justifying the difficulties of starting a freelance business. The passion mindset supports Fewer's decision. To those enthralled by the myth of a true calling, there's nothing more heroic than trading comfort for passion. Consider, for example, the author Pamela Slim, a believer in the passion mindset, who wrote the popular book Escape from Cubicle Nation. Slim describes on her website the following sample dialogue, which she claims she has often. Me. "So, are you ready to move forward with your plan?" Them. "I know what I have to do, but I don't know if I can do it. Who am I to pretend to be a successful artist, coach, consultant, masseuse? What if everyone looks at my website and laughs hysterically that I would even consider selling my services? Why would anyone ever want to connect with me?" Me. Time for a little work on your backbone. Motivated by these encounters, Slim launched a phone seminar product called Rebuild Your Backbone. Its goal is to convince more people to be like Lisa Fewer by finding the courage to follow their dreams. The course description says Slim will answer questions like, "Why do we get stuck living other people's models of success?" and "How do we get the courage to do big things in the world?" It costs $47. Rebuild Your Backbone is an example of the courage culture, a growing community of authors and online commentators pushing the following idea: the biggest obstacle between you and work you love is a lack of courage. The courage required to step away from other people's definition of success and to follow your dream. It's an idea that makes perfect sense when presented against the backdrop of the passion mindset. If there's some perfect job waiting for us out there, every day we're not following this passion is a wasted day. When viewed from this perspective, Fewer's move appears courageous and long overdue. She could be a guest lecturer in Pamela Slim's teleseminar. But this idea crumbles when viewed from the perspective of career capital theory, a perspective that makes Karma Kids Yoga suddenly seem like a poor gamble. The downside of the passion mindset is that it strips away merit. For passion proponents like Slim, launching a freelance career that gives you control, creativity, and impact is easy. It's just the act of getting started that trips us up. Career capital theory disagrees. It tells us that great work doesn't just require great courage, but also skills of great and real value. When Fewer left her advertising career to start a yoga studio, not only did she discard the career capital acquired over many years in the marketing industry, but she transitioned into an unrelated field where she had almost no capital. Given yoga's popularity, a 1-month training program places Fewer pretty near the bottom of the skill hierarchy of yoga practitioners, making her a long way from being so good she can't be ignored. According to career capital theory, she therefore has very little leverage in her yoga working life. It's unlikely, therefore, that things will go well for Fewer, which, unfortunately, is exactly what ended up happening. As the recession hit in 2008, Fewer's business struggled. One of the gyms where she taught closed. Then 2 classes she offered at a local public high school were dropped. And with a tightening economy, demands for private lessons diminished. In 2009, when she was profiled for the Times, she was on track to make only $15,000 for the year. Toward the conclusion of the profile, Fewer sends the reporter a text message. "I'm at the food stamp office now, waiting. It's signed, sent from my iPhone." 2 days after Lisa Fewer's profile was published, the Times introduced its readers to another marketing executive, Joe Duffy. Like Fewer, Duffy worked in advertising and eventually began to chafe at the constraints of corporate life. "I was tired of the agency business," he recalls. "I wanted to simplify my life and focus on the creative side again." Given that Duffy's original training was as an artist, he had entered the advertising industry as a technical illustrator only after he had a hard time making a living with his paintings. Supporters of the passion mindset might encourage someone in Duffy's situation to leave advertising behind and return to his passion for the creative arts. Duffy, it turns out, is from the craftsman school of thought. Instead of fleeing the constraints of his current job, he began acquiring the career capital he'd need to buy himself out of them. His specialty became international logos and brand icons. As his ability grew, so did his options. Eventually, he was hired away by the Minneapolis-based Fallon McElligott agency, which allowed him to run his own subsidiary within the larger organization, calling it Duffy Designs. In other words, his capital had bought him more autonomy. After 20 years at Fallon McElligott, working on logos for major companies such as Sony and Coca-Cola, Duffy once again invested his capital to gain more autonomy, this time by starting his own 15-person shop, Duffy & Partners. This entrepreneurial move contrasts sharply with Fewer's. Duffy started his own company with enough career capital to immediately thrive. He was one of the world's best logo men and had a waiting list of clients. Fewer started her company with only 200 hours of training and an abundance of courage. It's fair to guess that by the time Duffy recently retired, he loved what he did. His work gave him heaps of control and respect, and, depending on your view of the importance of advertising, also had a great impact on the world. To me, however, the most vivid contrast to Fewer's story was Duffy's purchase of Duffy Trails, a 100-acre retreat on the banks of Wisconsin's Tobotic River. Duffy is an avid cross-country skier, and the 5 miles of wooded trails, skiable from November through March, made the retreat irresistible. As reported by the New York Times, the property can comfortably house at least 20 guests, spread over 3 different residential outbuildings, but on the hottest summer nights, it's the screened gazebo by the retreat's 16-acre Bass Stock Lake that attracts the most visitors. Duffy purchased this property at the age of 45. In other words, not long after the age at which Fewer left advertising to pursue her yoga business. It's this parallel that gives this pair of stories their Frostian undertones. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and one traveler chose the path to mastery while the other was called toward passion's glow. The former ended up celebrated in the industry, in control of his own livelihood, and weekending with his family in a forested retreat. The latter ended up on food stamps. This comparison is not necessarily fair. We don't know that Fewer could have replicated Duffy's success if she had stayed in marketing and advertising and had focused her restless energy on becoming excellent. But as a metaphor, the story works nicely. The image of Fewer waiting in line for food stamps, while Duffy, at a similar age, returns from a successful overseas trip to spend a relaxing weekend skiing at Duffy Trails, is striking. It captures well both the risk and the illogic of starting from scratch, as contrasted with the leverage gained by instead acquiring more career capital. Both Fewer and Duffy had the same issues with their work. These issues emerged at around the same time, and they both had the same desire to love what they do. But they had 2 different approaches to tackling these issues. In the end, it was Duffy's commitment to craftsmanship that was the obvious winner. When craftsmanship fails. Not long before I started writing this chapter, I received an email from John, a recent college graduate and longtime reader of my blog. He was concerned about his new job as a tax consultant. Though he found the work to be sometimes interesting, the hours were long and the tasks were fiercely prescribed, making it difficult to stand out. Aside from not liking the lifestyle, John complained, I'm concerned that my work doesn't serve a larger purpose, and in fact, that it actively hurts the most vulnerable. This chapter has argued in favor of the craftsman mindset and against its passion-centric alternative. Part of what makes the craftsman mindset thrilling is its agnosticism toward the type of work you do. The traits that define great work are bought with career capital, the theory argues. They don't come from matching your work to your innate passion. Because of this, you don't have to sweat whether you've found your calling. Most any work can become the foundation for a compelling career. John had heard this argument and wrote me because he was having a hard time applying it to his life as a tax consultant. He didn't like his work, and he wanted to know if, like a good craftsman, he should just suck it up and continue to focus on getting good. This is an important question, and here's what I told John. It sounds like you should leave your job. On reflection, it became clear to me that certain jobs are better suited for applying career capital theory than others. To aid John, I ended up devising a list of 3 traits that disqualify a job as providing a good foundation for building work you love. 3 disqualifiers for applying the craftsman mindset. Number 1. The job presents few opportunities to distinguish yourself by developing relevant skills that are rare and valuable. Number 2. The job focuses on something you think is useless or perhaps even actively bad for the world. Number 3. The job forces you to work with people you really dislike. A job with any combination of these disqualifying traits can thwart your attempts to build and invest career capital. If it satisfies the first trait, skill growth isn't possible. If it satisfies the second 2 traits, then even though you could build up reserves of career capital, you'll have a hard time sticking around long enough to accomplish this goal. John's job satisfied the first 2 traits, so he needed to leave. To give another example, as a computer scientist at MIT, which I was while writing this book, I got quite a few emails from Wall Street headhunters. They were hiring for jobs that provide plenty of room to develop skills, and they're not afraid to compensate you well for your time. There is a small handful of firms on Wall Street that pay better than everyone else, about 3 or 4 of them, said one headhunter who wrote me recently. This company is one of them. I was later told by friends that the starting salary for these firms was in the $200,000 to $300,000 range. But to me, these firms satisfy the second condition previously mentioned. This realization allowed me to confidently delete these offers as they arrived. The big picture point worth noting here, however, is that these disqualifying traits still have nothing to do with whether a job is the right fit for some innate passion. They remain much more general. Working right, therefore, still trumps finding the right work. Now that I've made my pitch for the craftsman mindset and moderated it with the exceptions previously mentioned, it's time to see it in action.